I started thinking about this session, I had to reflect on the fact that the very first meeting to address issues of education and language in the Caribbean took place in 1957. And I don't know that many persons who participated in that one are still around and alive today. I certainly know many of them are dead, but and I also know that there were fewer than 15 people at that conference. I suspect that one or two of the generation called the older generation by Martha Dykoff a little while ago, the first generation by Martha Dykoff might just still be around. So in the interest of dealing with them, I shall not name those people. I sort of fall in between generations in the sense that I am neither, I suppose, fresh nor foul. I belong, in some people's minds, to the old, to the second set of people, and in my own mind, I belong to the third set, and I wish I could have belonged to the fourth set. So all these things kind of have me a little bit confused. I'm particularly pleased to have been asked to participate in this session, and I thought that by way of introduction, what I would normally do is have an apology. This is my style, is to start with an apology. And I've decided I'm too old now to continue apologizing, so I thought I'd tell you a story, which I call The Saga of Devenish, Rickford, and Robertson. It's a very short saga, actually. It started with Devenish asking me to do a short 10-minute presentation. And of course, I decided I can speak for 10 minutes. That's not a bit of a burden. I will undertake it because, well, I had to. And he then said, well, Rickford will do the other 10, which gave me additional assurance because I know whatever nonsense I might have done, John would have corrected it. And then a few days ago, he sent me a little note asking me not to swear, but telling me that John couldn't make it and could I do both sets of things. And, you know, I didn't swear. I wrote him acknowledging that that I recognized that I had to, and that this was not a request really, it was just an instruction that I should do it. And that, in fact, is what eventually has led you to have to tolerate me for the next few minutes or so into this session. I want to start by identifying with the themes of the conference, Creole and international languages in education, in the education system, should be systems really, language rights in the law, policy on indigenous and endangered languages. And I want to start by recognizing that once we start talking about language, we're talking about something that is exceedingly complex, and that in the region we're really talking about very varied linguistic contexts, even though at base in their fundamentals, and maybe even slightly higher up than fundamentals, they're essentially the same in the sense that they're all Creolophone societies. That there are many, many different dimensions to these societies, that a Guyana is not a Belize, that a Belize is not necessarily a Jamaica, but in the final analysis, we are all part of a linguistic experience that speaks to more commonality and more regionality than to our separateness, which we unfortunately have historically been trained to focus on. That language is sustained by the society in which it exists, and that therefore many of the considerations which must go into determining what we do will have to bear in mind the internal dictates of the society, the specific society to which we apply the sort of general principles. And maybe for me the most significant thing is the fact that when it comes to language, this is one case in which familiarity really breeds contempt. We seem to all know so much about education, and about language, and I'll refer to this in the context of language and education in a little while. But the tendency is for us to all assume a lot more knowledge and understanding and power than we really have. And it speaks to the need for us to develop the right kinds of sensitivities, not necessarily among us as linguists, but certainly among our peers in the wider societies, so that wise decisions could be taken. I want to deal with the themes quickly, but in reverse order. I want to start with the issue of language death. And I want to ask a few questions. Maybe, I'm not sure I can provide answers to them, but I want to just raise a few general questions. The first one is, what happens, and in this I'm expressing both my position as a linguist, hoping that this will indicate what linguistics has to offer, and at the same time, I'm hoping that by raising these issues, I'm indicating what we expect of the wider societies. What happens when a language dies? There are several positions on this, and last week we buried the first president of Trinidad and Tobago on Friday of last week. And the Chief Justice in his address said, when an old man dies, a library is burnt. He was quoting a West African proverb. And I began to wonder, what happens when a language dies? And discovered that the Nigerian writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in fact, speaks about death of a language, and he says, when we kill a language, we kill a people, we kill a way of life, and of course, naturally, we as human beings are the poorer for that experience. What we therefore clearly need to do is to recognize the symptoms, the possibilities of death, all the moribund factors that can lead very readily and very easily to the extinction of languages. We need to identify the contributory factors I'm just merely listing here. We need to be able to diagnose, in fact, whether those languages will die or whether they will survive, and sometimes we're going to be hellishly wrong. But what is important is that we need to have a means of dealing with these things. We need to be able to prescribe for them so that we know what to do in the event that the language is ailing. And we need to research. We need to accept death as an inevitable consequence of life when we can do nothing more about saving the language. And I say that as somebody who has been described as the midwife of language death by one of my colleagues who shall remain unnamed. I happen to have had to deal with two languages and to watch one of them die, or let me just tell the story. The first one, really, I like to tell stories. The first one is a language which, when I discovered it in 1975, had fewer than 30 speakers. And today, there is one speaker left alive. She's 94 years old and in very frail health. 5 years ago, we thought we had the last speaker. She was 103, and she died at 103. So now, this language is all but lost to the world, and somebody asked me the other day, to whom are you going to speak this language when this lady dies? What I do know is that when I mentioned to her grandson that she was the only person in the world who could do what she was doing, his entire countenance changed. This was 140 miles up a river in Guyana, and you suddenly say to that person, you see that lady? In terms of the entire world, she's unique. And we have not learned the value of that kind of thing. So when a language dies, we lose perhaps a whole way of life, and linguists are charged with the responsibility. Linguists certainly have the ability to attempt to get us to recognize the significance of the languages, then, having recognized that significance, to try to make the kinds of provisions for their preservation, and ultimately, since we must accept death as a feature of life, to arrange for the languages to be properly archived in such a way that even though the live speakers may have passed on, some of their wisdom, some of their understanding, some of the ways in which they divided the world would not be so easily lost. And some of the significance of the relationships would not be as easily lost as well. My own reflection on the status of, say, Bhojpuri in Trinidad and Guyana, and also in Suriname, has been that once these languages die, the very significant distinctions which they made between within family relationships, between relatives on the father's side and relatives on the mother's side, the significant ways in which they signal the gender of the particular relative, these things will go with the languages. They will perhaps affect the way in which we deal and treat with relatives on one side of the family and the other, and we all get reduced to a kind of least common factor, which doesn't really help us to move on. More than that, the more languages that die, the more alike persons in the world become. We lose the great diversity that is the advantage of being human. And there's no real pleasure in being exactly like the other person. So there's good reason why linguists should be encouraged to preserve languages in that sense.